Well, at this point, we are getting well into the 20th century in terms of movements going on in American religion, particularly looking at Protestantism and even a subset of Protestantism, what we historically call evangelicalism. But already, if I'm using that term by now, you're beginning to wonder, we've got all these different streams going on in American religion. We've already discussed the rise of Protestant liberalism, first going back to Europe, but then really emerging, really even in an indigenous way within the United States, and seeing this movement both in the North and in the South, and really as a phenomenon that touches all of American Protestantism. And I'm using the terms liberal and modernism, these terms sort of interchangeably to refer to this movement that comes along that seeks to reconceptualize Christianity for the modern world, remaking it without any apologies, remaking it, changing it in the most fundamental way into something that it was not previously. And they would have even recognized that. Although the theological liberals are also going to argue that really what they're remaking in some ways is going back to a purer early church, or really what the early church should have been if they had followed Jesus. And so again, it is a strongly revisionistic framework. And then following liberalism or modernism, and again, we're talking theology, not politics here. We're not talking about culture. We're talking about theology and religion. In reaction to that comes along, which is fundamentalism. And so these two sort of polar ends of American Protestantism for a while, for several years. You have liberalism or modernism on one side, and on the other far side, you have fundamentalism. You have a lot of people in the middle that would not have identified with either. In fact, the majority of people in the middle would not have identified with either, but you do have these two polar extremes that are vying for control and that are pulling and tugging on sort of the fibers of American religious life. And then eventually in the 1920s erupts into a full-on controversy, which we've already studied in the course, so I won't go back through all of that. But then after the 1920s, we get into the 1930s, and we have a bit of a lull. Part of that is because of the Great Depression and a lot of things going on in American life, and honestly, the fact that fundamentalism is forced to recede in American life. Or maybe one way to look at it is that American life moves on and leaves fundamentalism behind. I'm using figurative language, but it's some way to try to explain what happens to this group that at one point was seeming to be ascendant, and yet these conservatives, the fundamentalists, ultimately lose control of the institutions, of the schools, of the denominations. Some of them stay within the mainline denominations, the Baptists, the Episcopalians, some Presbyterians, Methodists. Some stay within the denominations. Others go on and found alternative institutions, alternative schools, alternative denominations. But still, throughout the 20th century, up until very recent times, you would have still had large numbers of much more conservative Christians within these denominations that are now under liberal influence and guidance and leadership. And so you would have still had a bit of a tug and a pull. And yet that becomes much less so once we get into the late 20th century and into the 21st. Not that it's gone entirely. You do still have some conservatives that are in these places, and yet, again, much really having no chance of any significant turnaround in those. And so which eventually, again, leads even more to leave and more. And that has been going on in large amounts since the 1970s. And continues to this day. So then I've got a third group that I'm primarily going to focus on in this video. And by the way, there is a PowerPoint presentation that goes along with this. I highly recommend that you look through it and perhaps even click through it as you're listening to this, or certainly after, go back and review it. And I think that's going to help a lot, just to have some images and to have some outline that really, I think, can help facilitate a better understanding as I work through this. As we move through the 1930s, something really important on the world scene is going on, and that's the very end of the 1930s in Europe and eventually the United States involvement in World War II. World War II for the United States really goes from about 1941 to 1945, and for that period of time, life is pretty consumed with the war. And so it's not that there wasn't religious life. Of course there is. Religious life doesn't end, and in fact, in some ways, it ascends during the war itself. And yet, really, it's after World War II that we move into a period. There's a third movement that comes along. You still have sort of the fundamentalist impulse that has not disappeared as we get into the 1940s. And you still have the liberal impulse, which also has been affected by the war. The optimism and sort of the progressive spirit has been, I would say, challenged by, honestly, the horrors of World War II. Already World War I, if that doesn't leave you pessimistic enough at the state of humanity and the need for salvation and redemption, World War II is so horrific. So many millions of lives are lost globally that it leaves people deeply disillusioned after the war. And so liberalism is not gone. They're still there in significant control of institutions, and yet it doesn't have the power that it did before. And so again, you have a bit of a lull religiously. And right about the same time, right after World War II, there is a new movement within Protestantism, in American religion, that in some ways, in significant ways, is looking back to what Protestant Christianity had been before fundamentalism, before liberalism. There was an evangelicalism, here I'm using that word, of the past that goes back to the Great Awakenings and to the revivals, into, again, much of American religious life before the 20th century, going back through the 19th century, as well as in the 18th century. And so that is there. We think of people like Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley and Charles Wesley, and many others after them, going all the way up through the 19th century. And so it's sort of a looking back to before the days of fundamentalism, before the days of liberalism, to find some sense of inspiration. And so there are three main figures that I want to talk about that sort of embrace what they call Neo-Evangelicalism. So a renewed evangelicalism that in large part agrees with the theology of fundamentalism. So they agree with the fundamentals of the faith. They agree with the essentials of the faith. They believe in biblical authority and biblical truthfulness. They believe in these essentials of the faith. They believe in the doctrine of the Trinity. They believe in the virgin birth and so on and so forth. They believe in the bodily resurrection of Christ. They agree theologically with fundamentalists, but they take issue with what they think is fundamentalism's isolationism and its strong hypersensitivity and defensiveness and aggressive posture. And so they say, hey, fundamentalists, we appreciate you guys, but we think that we can have a stronger influence in society. We think we can have a stronger prophetic voice if we actually don't go that route of sort of the militant antipathy that is present through the 1920s, for instance. Now, they are not theological liberals either. They forsake the revisionism of theological liberalism, but they also say, we're willing to engage with theological liberals. We're willing to engage with secular people. We're willing to be involved in pop culture and be involved, even eventually more and more, to have a voice in politics. And so Neo-Evangelicalism, which is the topic of this video, this lecture, and in large part our study for this week, it becomes a very important movement, and I'm going to talk about the three leaders who lead it. But let me tell you beforehand, and then I'll try to circle back around. This is a very important movement because it describes the evangelicalism that you and I know today. So there is a bit, and I'll talk about this more later, there is a bit of an identity crisis in evangelicalism today, and so that does remain to be said. But throughout the late 20th century and the early 21st century, what we call evangelicalism is neo-evangelicalism. Again, neither fundamentalist nor liberal. Now, granted, there is a bit of a spectrum within evangelicalism that we need to notice, and yet this movement that's being started here really has a significant impact in American religious life, and I would say in American life in general. So the first figure that I want to talk about, his name was Carl F.H. Henry. He lived from 1913 until 2003. He lived a long life. And in 1947, he wrote what in some ways is the launch of this movement. He wrote a book called The Uneasy Conscience of Modern Fundamentalism. So again, he himself agreeing with fundamentalism theologically in most ways. And yet what he takes issue with is what I was describing earlier, the posture, the approach, the philosophy, the missional philosophy, the world philosophy of fundamentalism. And I would strongly encourage you to read this book. I read it this summer again, having read it years ago. And although it was written in 1947, it speaks to today in a really remarkable way. I mean, you read it and you feel like this was written in this decade. It's really a remarkable little book. It's not long, 100 pages, 110 pages, very short. You can get it on Amazon for a few dollars probably. There's several that have a kind of a basic introduction that could kind of help guide you through it, or a preface. And so I strongly recommend that you would read that book, because again, it gives you insight into this movement, sort of a, not exactly a manifesto, but something like a manifesto for this Neo-Evangelicalism, and thus the evangelicalism that most of us know personally. Carl F. H. Henry is sometimes called the dean of evangelicalism. He was brilliant. He was exceptionally well educated. And again, that's part of the idea here is New Evangelicalism is going to say we need to not pull away from the academic world. We shouldn't pull away from the universities and intellectual life. We should be engaging them with the gospel, with the truth of God's word, with sophistication and clarity, but also with conviction. So he argued, and the others in Neo-Evangelicalism argued, we don't have to run away. We don't have to be afraid of these movements. Rather, we can take the truths of God's word and the convictions that Christians have held for 2,000 years, and we can step into those spaces. We can go to Ivy League schools, and many of them will. We can engage with academic research, and many of them did and do. And we can be involved in popular culture and in shaping and having an influence in American life rather than retreating in some ways. And so Carl F. H. Henry is in many ways the brains, the intellectual gravitas behind the movement that I'm calling Neo-Evangelicalism, that historians have called Neo-Evangelicalism. And so he and two other leaders formed this sort of triad that gives shape to this movement. Much more that I could say about this, but just to say one more time, the Neo-Evangelicals continue to hold on to their convictions theologically. They are unapologetic in them, and yet they believe that there's a way to engage intellectual life that in a way that is faithful, and yet also winsome and bold and thoughtful. So I've got some pictures here. You can look of him. One of them that I have in here is him as an older man. He was very influential on although he himself was not really a Southern Baptist, he was a member of a Southern Baptist church for a time. He was from Washington, D.C., and so there's a mixture of Baptist churches there, northern and southern. But he's really a national figure, and yet he was influential on Southern Baptist figures such as Albert Mohler at Southern Seminary, as well as several others. And in many ways, I think is someone still to this day that we can learn from, and I think even emulate in some significant ways. The next person I want to talk to is a name that you surely know. The second figure that's helping lead this movement is Billy Graham. So if Carl F. H. Henry is sort of the intellectual weight in the movement, Billy Graham is sort of the public picture of it. And I have a picture here of him standing in front of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. when he's a young man. Billy Graham, in so many ways, embodies this public posture of, again, being engaged, even in popular culture. When he would do his crusades, when he would do these movements, there was a significant sense in which he was reaching out. He would use popular music. He would use celebrities in a way to, again, to speak in a way that people could understand, even those who didn't understand Christianity, and even those who were more marginal in their understanding of Christianity. And so a powerful witness that he had. One figure said, when you thought of evangelicalism, you heard the voice of Billy Graham, this great sort of subtle Southern drawl, this deep voice. He was handsome, he was well-spoken, he was charismatic. He had such a presence. For decades, he's going on talk shows, he's having dinner in the White House, and in so many ways, he has this ability as a Christian witness to enter into the cultural conversation, again, rather than pulling away. And so while Carl F. H. Henry is in his study, writing God, Revelation, and Authority, this great multi-volume work that deals with exactly what the title describes, Scripture and Revelation and epistemology and several things, Billy Graham is out there doing the active social public work. Now, you may not know this, but Billy Graham began his public ministry all the way back in 1949 in the city of Los Angeles. Now, he's doing some work before this, and he's doing quite a bit of ministry before this, but it's in a very small and localized way. In 1949, he becomes a public figure, and then again has this platform now to do his work. In 1949, over just a few weeks, he holds this long crusade, which a crusade is a series of revival movements or of meetings. So really think like big evangelistic services. And 350,000 people came to hear him speak there in Los Angeles. And if you think of Los Angeles today, you often think of a very secular city, a very progressive city. And yet at this time, LA was an up-and-coming city. You go back just a few decades and there was not much in Los Angeles. It was basically an oil town. It was not a place that people were flocking to. But as you get closer after World War II and closer into the middle of the 20th century, the city is booming in growth from a number of ways. But one of the ways it was growing is that something like up to 2.5 or 3 or even more, about 3 million people are moving from the old Southwest, Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, Louisiana, Kansas, Arkansas, that area. People are moving to the West because of the Great Depression. They're looking for jobs, and there's a lot of new jobs in California. And the other thing is you have the Dust Bowl. I lived in Oklahoma. That Dust Bowl is an important part of the history here in the 1930s. It just decimated the region. And so a lot of people moved out to Los Angeles and Southern California, throughout Southern California, looking to start a new life. And so John Steinbeck, in his book Grapes of Wrath, has a really great way of demonstrating this very movement. And so Billy Graham is able to go there and draw on this. You have all these people there looking for hope, looking for answers, and so he's able to step into that and speak truth and preach the gospel. He became a celebrity, as I said, in many ways, and yet it was in this neo-evangelical stream that he's doing this, and he is working closely. So it's not just in some sort of loose subconscious way. He is actively connected to the work that I was describing earlier with Carl F. H. Henry, and the two of them are working with one more person, and that's who I want to look at next. His name was Harold Ockinga. And so if Billy Graham is the public sort of pop cultural figure and Carl Henry is the dean, the intellectual figure, well, Harold Ockinga is the statesman and the pastor. So his name is not as well known, and maybe you didn't know Carl Henry either. You almost certainly knew Billy Graham. Harold Ockinga's name is not as well known, but yet he was very much involved here. He is the one who founds the NAE, the National Association of Evangelicals. That's one way he's serving as a statesman, but also, again, as a preacher, as a pastor. He's in the eastern U.S., in the Northeast, but yet very involved in what's going on broadly, nationally, in this neo-evangelical movement. And so I point him out not only because he's an important leader along with these other two, but also because movements like this is just kind of a side note in history. Movements often have figures like Ockinga who sort of work behind the scenes, whose names are not as famous, who are not, honestly, maybe not interested in the limelight, and yet have significant formative influence. The last thing I want to talk about is the fruit of this movement, because very often you might say, okay, so what was good about this? Okay, we understand what happened to fundamentalism. We understand what happened to liberalism to some extent. What's the long-term fruit of neo-evangelicalism? Well, again, eventually the neo is dropped and we just speak about evangelicalism. But this sort of ethos of the movement, to be engaged in culture, to be intellectually sophisticated, and to not shy away from the hard questions and conversations and cultural interaction. One thing they did was they founded institutions. And so they founded the school Fuller Theological Seminary in Fuller, where Carl F. H. Henry actually worked. It was named after Charles Fuller, a minister in California. And so this seminary, which still stands today, of course, it's in Pasadena in Southern California, really develops the ethos of this movement, and the hope would be that for decades that it could sort of be the shining light of neo-evangelicalism. Now the seminary is still there, and honestly, it's still a fairly strong seminary. Theologically, it has moved slightly further to the left, and yet still it is an evangelical school. I spoke about kind of the spectrum, right? If you still have some that are very much more on the conservative side of evangelicalism, and those who would be, can I just call it more progressive? Okay, not fully theological, liberal. That again, I want you to see how extreme in terms of revision liberalism is, and yet one could be an evangelical still, and yet be slightly more progressive culturally, politically, and so on. And so if we look at that, what I'm calling this spectrum, Fuller Seminary is a bit further to the left, and yet still very much in this spirit of evangelicalism. Other schools are not necessarily founded, but yet sort of embrace the Spirit. Schools like Wheaton College in Illinois is very much a school that was founded much earlier, actually, and yet becomes really the epitome of this vision for Neo-Evangelicalism. I mentioned earlier they established the National Association of Evangelicals, which becomes a way to connect broadly evangelicals. So evangelicalism is and has been, again, going back to even what we saw back in the 18th and 19th century and the early 20th century, evangelicalism is interdenominational. So you have Methodists, you have Baptists, you have Presbyterians, you have non-denominational folks, you have Bible churches. So all of these groups could come together under this broader umbrella to try to do kingdom work. They also established a magazine that would be sort of a mouthpiece for this movement. And if we were in class together, I would ask you if you knew what it is. And there's probably a good chance you might be able to figure out. The magazine is called Christianity Today, which is still an important magazine within evangelical Christianity. And so Billy Graham was a significant part of founding this magazine. Now, the last thing that I'll say is that in the 1970s and 80s, there's a lot going on politically and socially in the United States, and I don't have all the time to go into it. But evangelicals, now we'll just call them evangelicals, become more engaged in the political sphere in the 1970s and 80s. It's not to say that they weren't engaged at all before, but now they're more engaged. And since then, they've become exceptionally engaged, especially at least the way that the media perceives of them. And again, I can't untangle all of these knots, but the one thing I did want to point out is that in recent years, they have been increasingly, evangelicals of which I belong, they've become increasingly labeled primarily as a political movement. That's regrettable. It's not regrettable that evangelicals are engaged. I think that every Christian should be faithful, should be engaged, should be prayerful, should be aware and knowledgeable and active in terms of things that have real-world consequences. That's not my point. But I think it is regrettable that evangelicals have, in part because of the way that the media has shaped things, but also in part because for some people, politics has become an all-consuming passion and an all-consuming occupation. And so I think in some ways, maybe the balance has been tipped there. And so now we are grappling with, especially over the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years even, an evangelicalism identity crisis in which are we primarily theological, religious? Are we really about the gospel? Are we about the kingdom? Or are we about a certain view of politics and social engagement and so on? And so there are some good books that are grappling with this, and I believe I've got part of that listed in the slide, so you can look at that. But this is a movement that I think we have to understand not only institutions and denominations today, but really even some of our own sentiments and our own instincts. I think we can see a lot of that as we work through. So may the Lord bless you. We'll keep pushing ahead into our studies in the 20th century.